Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In this special 6-part summer series, you will hear recordings of papers delivered at the Robert Menzies Institute's conference on the Menzies Ascendency, Implementing a Liberal Agenda and Consolidating Gains 1954 to 1961. The conference was held over 2 days from the 23rd to the 24th of November 2023. In today's episode of the summer series, you will hear from former Australian diplomat Dr. Bob Bowker on Menzies, Eisenhower and Suez, followed by Sean Jacobs on skillful handling Menzies and the West New Guinea dispute, and finally Dr. Elizabeth Buchanan on Menzies and the Antarctic Treaty.
Thank you, Georgina. Thank you, Zach, very much for this opportunity to speak. And may I also acknowledge in the presence here today of David Kemp. 55 years ago, David actually introduced me to the whole vista of international relations in a series of extraordinary lectures on the origins of the First World War. And in David's delivery, he brought to life the interaction of power and politics and personalities, as well as the structures that were involved in that process. And as a raw country boy, undergraduate, it, as I say, opened up whole new vistas of understanding how the world actually operates. And after 37 years in DFAT and 25 as an academic, I still look back on that educational experience. I'm here today to talk about Menzies and Suez, not Menzies' finest moment by any imagination, but for those of you who are not old enough to remember the details, I'll just very briefly traverse what happened. The Aswan High Dam project had been the centrepiece of the incoming Egyptian regime's in plans to modernise Egypt and the Egyptian economy and so on after 1952. It was the centrepiece for NASA. And in July 56, following the sudden and highly discourteous withdrawal of funding for that dam by the United States and by the British, NASA responded by nationalising the Suez Canal. And that, of course, generated great international concern, and Australia joined the UK in seeking to reverse the nationalisation by Egypt of the Suez Canal Company. And although subsequent negotiations under the auspices of the United Nations made pretty good progress toward resolving the dispute, Anglo-French forces invaded Egypt in early November of 1956, supposedly to protect the Suez Canal from fighting between Egypt and Israel. In fact, the attack had been launched initially by Israel in late October as part of a plan conceived by France and Israel and endorsed by the UK, seeking to achieve the overthrow of NASA through the humiliation of a major military defeat. It wasn't about the canal. Ultimately, it was about NASA and what NASA stood for in the 1950s, the post-colonial era that was facing the British and the French in North Africa. The outcome was a ceasefire imposed by Eisenhower on the UK and France. It was the humiliation of British Prime Minister Anthony Eden and the UK government, and it was the end of Eden's political career. It was an outcome that was inevitable as it was predictable. But as I say, although we weren't a party to the conflict, Australia was affected. We immediately joined the UK in seeking to reverse the nationalisation, and in early September 1956, following a conference in London of the principal canal-using countries, and at the request of the US and the Britain, Menzies led a delegation to Cairo, seeking without success to persuade Nasser to relinquish control of the canal to an international body. And then when the conflict broke out in late October, at the direction of Menzies, who had the very enthusiastic backing of his cabinet, except for the Foreign Minister, Richard Casey, Australia gave complete support to the British in the United Nations context and elsewhere. We did so in very limited company, and we took it to such a point that Australia's diplomatic relations with Egypt were severed by the Egyptians on the 6th of November 1956, and they weren't restored until 1959. In effect, Australia became part of the UK's imperial twilight in the Middle East. Now, most historians focus, I think, unfairly on the Menzies visit to Cairo and the results that came from that. And they also focus, I think, somewhat excessively on Menzies' part in the ideological blinkering and the systemic weaknesses that underlay the formulation of policy where Britain was concerned. Suez was an interesting case because it did preoccupy the government. It took 7 cabinet submissions in 1956. Nothing that I came across in the archives even approached that level of cabinet consideration as a foreign policy issue in that year. But the point that Bill Hudson and Alan Martin and Mac Ball and others came to conclude about Menzies' performance was that it was a demonstration of blind loyalty to his British connections and his sense of British identity. There was a moment when Eden was under extreme pressure and Menzies wrote to him and tried to reassure him in Menzies' words that you must never doubt the British quality of this country. It was a stance that stood in marked contrast to the much broader vision that Menzies and his government displayed during the 1950s on many of the things that you've been talking about today, including ANZUS, Colombo Plan and so on. This determination to back the British at all costs was actually something which was not consistent with the overall pattern of the government's behaviour. On the Menzies mission, that loyalty was clearly not the reason why Menzies was unsuccessful. Simply put, Menzies presented on behalf of the British and the United States and the other canal users a case that failed on its merits against the background of Nasser's determination to rid his country and the Arab world of the vestiges of Western colonialism. But the depiction of the mission as a total failure, I think, is simplistic. It deserves greater nuance than it gets. Menzies went to Cairo seeking to restore international control of the canal because that was deemed to be in Australia's interest, fair enough. It was standing up for Britain's place in the region and the world. Well, that's a little less, a little more contestable. But mostly because he was willing, indeed he was keen, to carry the ball on behalf of Eden and for Foster Dulles, whose actions had actually precipitated the crisis, but who was a bit too canny to be involved in trying to sort it out in Cairo. From the British and French perspectives, Nasser's refusal of Menzies' propositions was an outcome that they actually desired. It was part of clearing the deck for the military campaign they'd always had in mind to fulfil their undeclared ambition of removing Nasser. From Dulles' perspective, the mission, like a fiasco that came in its wake about what the users were going to call themselves and do. The mission revealed clear differences in the perceptions between the US and the UK about how to deal with NASA, but it also gave Dulles time, he hoped, for tempers to cool in London and elsewhere. And in that very limited sense, at least, I think Dulles could say he was at least partially or somewhat successful. And ultimately, Menzies never really had anyone to negotiate with. NASA wasn't going to negotiate about what he had just done. His country's ambition, his credibility were attached to what he had done. And before Menzies arrived in Cairo, NASA had already told the Americans that although it might take the Menzies Committee 2 days to present their suggestions, he would give them about an hour to make his case. And if they wanted to talk about tolls and finance and so on, that's fine. But he firmly rejected the substance of what Menzies was putting to him. And NASA's detailed written response to the letter from Menzies, which laid out in detail his delegation's proposals, was both entirely dismissive of the proposals, but it was also devoid of any suggestion that NASA was open to negotiation about those proposals. It also didn't really matter very much, I think, to either Menzies or NASA that the mission was unsuccessful. The discussions weren't particularly acrimonious. There was one marvellous moment, not reported to Canberra, but recorded in the minutes of the committee's own internal meetings and by the Egyptian side among themselves that I've seen. There was this moment when tempers were raised between Menzies and NASA. NASA threatened somewhat theatrically to walk out when Menzies told NASA rather clumsily that there wouldn't be a problem unless the Egyptians refused to accept what he was proposing, in which case that would be the beginning of trouble, and only if there were no agreement could your people be imposed upon. Probably the worst choice of language you could come up with under those circumstances. And although NASA and his colleagues were offended by Menzies' imperious style, the vilification of Menzies in the Egyptian media didn't actually come until some time later, at which point he was roundly described as an imperialist mule and a few other things as well, all about standard fare for that sort of environment. But what I really want to talk about today mostly is the Menzies interaction with Eisenhower, because if there is one area upon which Menzies, I think, can justly be criticised, it is, in fact, his inclination to ignore US advice and clearly to exceed his brief. For example, he warned NASA informally that NASA could not exclude the possibility of conflict. Menzies had no authority to say that. He certainly hadn't been asked by the conference to do so, nor indeed by the British or the French. From the outset of the crisis, Dulles had told Menzies that of Dulles' concerns at the prospects of Britain and France taking quick and firm military action to bring NASA to heel. Dulles had made it absolutely clear there should be no ultimatum to Egypt arising from the meeting or indeed from Menzies' visit. And although there is no record in the Australian archives of Menzies meeting with Eisenhower on the 3rd of August 1956, shortly before the London conference, it is highly likely that Eisenhower would have reiterated to Menzies his absolute opposition to the use of force. NASA, for his part, had already told the Americans he expected the Western powers to attempt to use military force against him. It wasn't news to NASA when Menzies took him aside and gave him this warning. In fact, the only thing that NASA was surprised about was that that the British chose to be associated with the Israelis in what they did. NASA responded to his intelligence official who told him that an Israeli attack with British and French support was imminent. NASA said, "What? Can't be, my son. The British have a sense of principle." No one could be so obtuse as to be trying to attack us via the Israelis. After the Cairo visit, Menzies seized upon supposed comments by Eisenhower to rationalise his inability to win his case with NASA. He told his cabinet colleagues it would have been better to leave NASA guessing about the possible use of force, although, as I said, he had no authority to even mention that. And Menzies even complained directly to Eisenhower on the 13th of September 56 about Eisenhower's alleged comments without providing any evidence or any details of those comments. There was a wonderful cable reporting this conversation in which Eisenhower is quite clearly taken aback by what Menzies is saying. He replied to Menzies that he couldn't recall saying anything while Menzies was in Cairo, but if he had, he was sorry. From my checking of the press, the only reported comment by Eisenhower, in fact, was a very brief reaffirmation of something he had said well before Menzies had arrived in Cairo, just reiterating in half a sentence that the US remained opposed to the use of force. And a careful reading of the record of the Cairo meetings and the associated records of the Menzies Committee in Cairo and Menzies' own correspondence with Eden while he was in Cairo through the British Embassy, neither of which make any reference to remarks by Eisenhower while Menzies was in Cairo, and then NASA's immediate informal dismissal of Menzies' presentation, even though he took a couple of days to come up with a formal response, and the timing of Menzies' criticism of Eisenhower, which actually began only after Menzies had returned to London and met with Eden. That's when Menzies suddenly started talking about his sense of betrayal at what Eisenhower had supposedly said. It all strongly suggests that Menzies' complaints about Eisenhower were mostly, if not entirely, an exercise in the political management in Australia, and possibly with a view to his memoirs, of the negative result. There's no doubt that Menzies wanted the USA and the UK to act in unison regarding Suez, but unlike Pearson of Canada, there is no archival evidence that Menzies sought to bridge the differences between Washington and London beyond rhetorical appeals. His main concern throughout the crisis and its immediate aftermath was to persuade Eisenhower on the correctness of Eden's approach. And like the remainder of his cabinet, with the exception of Casey and sometimes McBride, the defence minister, each of whom had a much more sophisticated view of what was involved, Menzies was utterly determined that NASA needed to be put in his place, that Britain was not to become another Portugal, and he was absolutely scathing about the concern of Eisenhower to seek to resolve the crisis through the United Nations. Menzies was certainly aware of the disagreement between London and Washington over how to respond to the nationalisation. He was actually in possession of correspondence between Eden and Eisenhower, highlighting Eisenhower's rejection of Eden's arguments for the use of force, and Menzies withheld that documentation from his cabinet colleagues. He was surely aware that there was personal rancour between Eden and Dulles. It was common knowledge. And while Menzies sought afterwards to play it down, there was friction in Cairo between Menzies and the US delegate, Loy Henderson, who Menzies discovered to his consternation was actually instructed by the State Department to explore the possibilities of there being a negotiation with Nasser. But it really wouldn't have made much difference if Menzies had shared with his cabinet colleagues the full extent of his knowledge of the differences between Eden and Eisenhower over Suez, or more precisely over the question of whether military force ought to be used. Throughout the crisis, the intellectual quality of the debate in cabinet discussion within the Menzies cabinet regarding Suez was abysmal, absolutely abysmal. And when the conflict broke out, cabinet's determination to support the UK was based entirely on political grounds. It was unencumbered by strategic analysis, willingness to question UK motives, consideration of possible consequences for US-Australia relations, or even any assessment of Eden's prospects for success. The risk to Australia's relations with the United States of giving such a strong support to Eden was barely mentioned in cabinet discussion or in briefings. There was this general feeling in cabinet of condescension towards the United States, including references to the need to tone up the US approach to align with that of the UK. An analysis of regional political realities was entirely absent. Casey counselled restraint, but Casey didn't have the political skills for his unsolicited advice to go anywhere. Arthur Tang, probably one of the most sober public servants of the era, tried to counsel restraint to Menzies, and Menzies similarly ignored him. In fact, Tang was excluded from the discussions with Nasser. He was allowed to go to Cairo, but Menzies kept him in the anteroom with the other officials. And the consequence of all of this was that there were limited inputs from foreign affairs that sought to shape the general direction that the government was taking. It was, as in the case of the British, officials found themselves having to struggle to get ministerial attention, while ministers sought to decide for themselves the course that they wanted to take. So in practice, Australia wound up directing its diplomatic energy towards goals that were either beyond reach, such as restoration of international control of the canal, or the question of freedom of navigation through the canal, the disruption of which was perhaps a disconcerting possibility, as one cabinet submission put it, but it was far from being an actual or an unmanageable threat. Meanwhile, the British spoke to mythologies shared with Menzies about British identity and nobility of purpose and so on that were largely immune from Casey's concerns and arguments. And Menzies, the Anglophile Australian nationalist, desperately wanted Eden to throw him the ball. And Eden repaid that by waving him off to Cairo to deal with Nasser. And Menzies continued to give him the strongest possible political support in Parliament and UN Security Council voting and so on, even as the British position deteriorated. And Menzies maintained his contact with Eden through the British High Commission in Canberra. The Foreign Affairs, External Affairs officers who were involved in this tended to be brought into the picture after Menzies had been in touch with Eden. There's no evidence of inputs by External Affairs to his correspondence with Eden. It was very much Menzies and presumably Bunting and Alan Brown and a few others, but a very tight-knit group around Menzies who controlled that whole discussion. While I've got 5 minutes, I'll just mention, because I think people may like to know, especially the former diplomats among us, that I had the opportunity, by studying this material, to discover one of the most remarkable but almost unknown moments in Australian diplomacy. Some 11 days after Eisenhower had imposed his will on the British and broken Eden's career as Prime Minister, Menzies took it upon himself, his own initiative, but with Eden's enthusiastic support, to write to Eisenhower, castigating him for the US stance, opposing the use of force against NASA and so on. The idea of interjecting unsolicited advice into the spat between Eden and Eisenhower should, as Banjo Paterson would have said, made even the boldest hold their breath. But Menzies waved the proverbial stockwhip and in he went. He told Eisenhower, who had just experienced the British casting a veto on his Security Council resolution and had launched their attack in the middle of the Russian invasion of Hungary, for heaven's sake. Timing, no problem. Menzies wrote to Eisenhower and said the US handling of the issue in the United Nations had failed to understand the British position. It had been inopportune. It had left the British and French not only rebuked but humiliated to the benefit of the Russians and NASA. And he warned Eisenhower that unless the UN peacekeeping force being assembled as part of the Anglo-French withdrawal was cohesive and powerful and effective enough to prevent NASA enjoying the spoils of his victory, then quick consideration may conceivably be given to resuming military operations. 11 days after the ceasefire had been imposed by the Americans. So it fell to Casey, who was in New York, to deliver this message to Eisenhower. Unfortunately for Casey, Eisenhower didn't want to see him. So that gave Casey and Jim Plimsoll, who was travelling with him, a few days to try to work out what to do with this particular missive. And Plimsoll, although it's again not in the DFAT archives, but in Plimsoll's own diary, I found that Plimsoll shared this message from Menzies to Eisenhower with his British counterparts. And the upshot was that Plimsoll and Casey came up with what they described as a summary of its main points, which they handed over together with the Menzies letter to Herbert Hoover, who was the acting Secretary of State. And surprisingly enough, the summary, which Casey wisely did not send back to Canberra before he handed it over, excluded the condescending language employed by Menzies and the inflammatory reference to resuming the fighting, in favour of some gracious comments about US strength and prestige and the importance of the United States and Britain resolving their differences. So Eisenhower provided a cool but decidedly cool but courteous response to Menzies a week later, and the whole thing just sank without trace. I don't think there's any doubt that the finest Australian diplomacy during the Suez Crisis was the part played by Casey and Plimsoll between Menzies and Eisenhower.
Thank you very much, Zach, for this opportunity, and Georgina as well, and everyone for being here this afternoon. So I know I'm the last presentation of the day and everyone's probably running out of steam, so I promise not to trespass on my time, and we're running long as well. So my name's Sean Jacobs, and I'm here to present on Menzies, and the West New Guinea dispute. And I just have to say, just first off the bat, as a quick caveat, I'm not a West New Guinea or Irian Jaya expert or Indonesian expert. A lot of my experience and background is on the east eastern side of the Papuan border in Papua New Guinea, where I was born, where I've worked on and off over the years, and where I've featured in quite a lot of commentary, I guess, over the last sort of 10 years, writing for various publications. And I do know Menzies' story quite well. I cite him a lot, or his leadership lessons, in my first book. And as Georgina and George are aware, in my second book on Neville Bonner, I talk a lot about the overlap in the philosophies between Robert Menzies and Neville Bonner, which is quite unique. So I think that this was really quite interesting to put together when looking at this issue, or blending my background and examining this issue over the past 12 months. I think Menzies, if you look back on this from, I guess, where we are today, and you just take a fleeting look at the actual West New Guinea dispute, you could even see Menzies' weakness in the face of a lumbering Indonesia. That's what you might say if you look at the issue and skim the surface on it. But what it actually reveals to me, which I think was fascinating, was the cadence of an independent, measured and balanced foreign policy. And I'll loop back to this as well. And I didn't want to start with too much history or context, but I thought it would just be useful to put up a slide on the background in terms of historical bearings. So what I guess is important to note from this is the issue kind of broke into 3 phases. It was supposed to actually take only a year to resolve, because it couldn't get resolved in 1949 between the Dutch and the Indonesians. And again, I'll touch on this. So it took longer than 12 months, which was anticipated in the 1949 agreement, and didn't get resolved until 1962. And actually, if you look at the plebiscite when West New Guinea was formally absorbed into Indonesia, that didn't actually occur until 1969. But the important point is that the West New Guinea dispute almost overlaps perfectly with the theme of the conference and the Menzies liberal ascendancy. Now, just taking a step back, and my starting point for context here is Condoleezza Rice, which might seem a bit sort of strange, but she just gave a knockout quote in 2008 when asked if, with 9/11, with Iraq and Afghanistan, if she had had it tough being US Secretary of State. And she said, well, look, imagine being a policy planner in the US State Department at the end of World War II. You've got communist parties taking almost half the vote in France and Italy. Germany is Berlin's cut down the middle in Germany by the Soviet Union and Stalin. And the Soviets, of course, explode a nuclear weapon 5 years ahead of schedule. And closer to our neck of the woods, China's communists seize power by defeating the Nationalist Army. The Korean War breaks out in 1950. That would eventually kill 37,000 US troops and 339 UN troops, I should say. And also the beginnings of the Vietnam War emerged through the Indochina War, which would, of course, go on to claim 523 Australian lives. And we've touched on this a bit today, but there was probably 3 things that I think were on Menzies' mind at this time. I think clearly Indonesia's communist vulnerabilities. Alan Dulles, as Bob just mentioned before, was then NSA to Eisenhower, and he touched on this. Richard Casey as well was flagging this and the concern of communist members being part of the Indonesian cabinet. I guess when it came to Indonesia's political and economic instability, Sukarno, there were internal tensions growing at the time between him, various religious figures, the PKI, and at least from the 1950s, regional rebellions were actually taking place against Sukarno among top military officials. And then, of course, there's territory as well. So we often think, with West New Guinea and geographical proximity to Australia, but you have to keep in mind as well that then Papua New Guinea was then Australian territory, being pre-1975. So I've just included that short quote from Geoffrey Blaney. Just briefly, so in terms of the actual issue at hand, and I didn't want to get into a full-blown account of what the competing historical claims were between the Dutch and the Indonesians, but when we talk about the Dutch East Indies, we generally know or refer to a period between the 16th century and 1945. And of course, the Dutch didn't have complete control of Indonesia, and of course Indonesia didn't exist as we know it today, which I think is just an important historical or just context rather to keep in mind. So I guess the big takeaway here, and we were just talking about this on the table before, is the Indonesian War of Independence from 45 to 49 claimed 100,000 lives, and it was incredibly brutal, but it's kind of a blind spot in history. So again, I didn't want to spend too much time on that point, but just to come to Menzies' position on this. And these points are taken from a 1961 piece by Henry Elbinski, but I think it just perfectly sums up Menzies' position on this. And he, I guess like the Dutch, he claimed there was a very limited historical title. Indonesia didn't exist, like I mentioned, and in terms of a direct territorial claim, that was quite hazy. The ethnic differences in West New Guinea, I think that's quite obvious. Just if you look at the fault lines there and the people, just their distinctive look compared to the rest of Indonesia. There was no strong indigenous or local desire in West New Guinea to be part of Indonesia as well. And then also I think that Dutch resources that could actually be deployed to assist West New Guinea with self-determination was actually important to remember as well. And I think that Menzies would have probably been most motivated by that point if you look at his philosophy, especially around self-development and creating an arena for individuals to do well. So just in terms of a broader foreign policy outlook, I touched on, I go back in the paper to not directly to Menzies, but to actually Spender, his first foreign minister during this period, and a 9 March 1950 parliamentary address. And it really is quite impressive. If you go back and read this, it's almost like a white paper of its day. And there's a remarkable consistency. So you could read this today and change the typeset, and there's a lot of consistency around articulation of Australia's physical place in the world, working cooperatively within the region, the importance of shoring up alliances and reeling in traditional allies such as Britain and the United States, but particularly to be more involved in Southeast Asian affairs. And our goal, Spender said, and I think it's a very Menzian line, was the preservation of peace and our way of life when it came to our foreign policy. And of course, Spender also appeared optimistic, at least outwardly, about Indonesia. He noted its refreshed independence and its new government trying to mould, and I'll quote, a new nation out of Indonesia's 70 million people when he spoke of Sukarno in particular. And there's also just one element that I think that's really important that I think is very much a Menzian point, especially when it came to communism, and this was articulated in Spender's speech, and especially in China. And he said it's not for us to question the kind of government the Chinese people live under. And I think that that's, again, a very Menzian point for individuals to choose their own destiny, that it wasn't in Australia's interest to try and curtail that. Very quickly, I think it's really important to touch on what the US position was at the time here. Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State from 49 to 53, was encouraged by figures like the great Cold War architect George Kennan, who's on the top left there, and I'll quote that the US should not let nature take its course. The US should let nature take its course in Asia. And Acheson and Kennan, reasoned that unless China would make, or the United States would make China their enemy first. So I think the US, therefore, was firmly in the game of persuasion in Asia. And I think further south, it set itself apart to not antagonise Indonesia about it falling into communist hands. And I think it shared that British desire for compromise. And I've got John Howard in here because he writes in the Menzies era, and I'll quote, "The United States had remained neutral on the issue of West New Guinea, this is, partly because if all other things were equal, Washington always liked to be seen as siding with those who had thrown off colonialism." So I guess the real pinch point, though, on this issue came, or the turning point, in 1961 when the US and the Brits got wind that Sukarno was about to invade West New Guinea. Now, you recall that up until this time, a lot of soul-searching had taken place around the intervening years, from 50 to 54, the Indonesian-Dutch bilaterals, 54 to 58, Indonesia prosecuting its case at the UN General Assembly, and then 60 to 62, an element of confrontation between Indonesia and the Netherlands as well. But I think Menzies was really alive to Sukarno's threat, I think he knew that Sukarno was simply calling the Americans bluff. And as the quote shows, that Menzies was disappointed because he knew that this move would ultimately reduce the opportunities for a negotiated settlement if Sukarno did indeed turn to violence. I guess this probably just highlights, and I'll let everyone absorb that, but the Brits and the Americans were wanting to persuade and woo the Indonesians. And I think the Dutch position just simply became under siege due to this ascendance of the threat of communism and, again, not wanting Indonesia to fall into that space. So as Macmillan articulated to Menzies, this was a choice of evils. No one wanted communism, but the immediacy of the situation had clearly changed. So look, just summing up, and these are just the points I touched on before and then I mentioned at the start. Menzies stayed really steady and consistent. I think Paul mentioned this morning about being principled throughout the issue. And I think that really just made, or I guess what really brings that out is being steady and principled enabled Menzies to stay statesmanlike throughout this issue. So this was a 1959 visit when the West New Guinea issue was obviously at an apex. But Menzies travelled to Indonesia and he made the point that we've got 10 times as much in common as we have in difference. And just very quickly, I'll read an extract from the speech, and I quote, "I want you to know this about Australia. We are, I think, just about the most friendly people. We do not have hostile relations with anybody. That is not to say we do not have strong views on some subjects, and we are capable of expressing them. You cannot expect the rest of the world will agree with you on everything. We have 10 times as much in common than we have in difference." And 5,000 students actually applauded him in Jakarta, one even saying "good speech" as Menzies left his address, which I hope you'll provide to me as well. But look, just very briefly, a final footnote on the contemporary situation in West Papua. Zach mentioned this or touched on this before. I think Menzies is really exclusively and unfairly seen by some as serving his prime ministerships exclusively with uncritical subservience to policymakers in Whitehall and Westminster. And Bob touched on the blind loyalty point before. As part of the 56 Suez Crisis. But I think the West New Guinea dispute, where Menzies took an alternate stance to US and Britain, is just a minor pronounced footnote that's a bit of a blind spot to these assumptions. And I think there's a lot that West Papua activists can take from Menzies during the dispute, but I don't think that that'll be the case. Thanks very much.
Thank you for the opportunity, Georgina and Zachary, to delve into Australia's Antarctic history. It is an utterly overlooked aspect of the Menzies legacy. The period 1957 to 61 was fundamental for the Antarctic continent and for Menzies. The Menzies government achieved a global cooperation treaty at the heights of the Cold War. Menzies drove 2 blocks to one table to negotiate. Over 60 years have passed since the success of this period for Menzies, and it is further underscored by the fact that the treaty remains in place. My research explores Menzies and the Antarctic Treaty. My chapter examines the period pre-treaty, the negotiation years, the first consultative party treaty meeting, which was hosted by Menzies in Canberra in 1961. All right, so for the paper, I used our archives in Canberra, as well as the British archives in London, to gain insight into the 1950 political assessments of Antarctica. I found 3 points of interest, which are examined in my chapter at length. First, Menzies did not necessarily expect the treaty to hold in place post-Cold War. Menzies viewed it as a holding pattern of sorts, to allow liberal democracies like Australia to starve off Cold War conflict and to avoid potential communist bases on Australia's southern approaches. Second, Menzies had a somewhat idealistic view of science and the utility of global cooperation on this front. Science in Antarctica today is very much a Trojan horse of sorts for ramping up state activity and footprints on the continent. And third, Menzies' Antarctic legacy was complicated by the Red Scare of the late 50s and the domestic political turmoil triggered by the Petrov affair and subsequent suspicions of entrenched Soviet influence in Canberra. The complicating factor being that in the 1958 to 1960 era, Menzies found a partner in the Soviet Union when it came to Antarctica. So today, I will begin with a brief discussion of the pre-1950s era, I call Meltdown, move to 1957, a period I call Eviction. In 1958, I'll speak to the Antarctic Treaty negotiation era, before I move to 1959 to delve into the signing of the Antarctic Treaty. 1961, of course, will cover the first meeting of the Antarctic Treaty consultative parties in Canberra. I'll finish and leave you with 2020, a contemporary reflection on science in Antarctica to illustrate the Menzies vision for the proliferation of global scientific cooperation in action. So really briefly, and apologies to those in the room that are well versed in the current claims. But I thought it was really important to briefly illustrate the 7 claims we have that are neither accepted or denied in an international legal sense. Simply the progression of any discussion over them is held off and has been set aside while the treaty remains in place. What this map does not show, but it is really important to grasp, is that under the treaty, the US and Russia have their right to claim any or all of the continent protected. Should the treaty come to an end, a unilateral departure of a state or states, then the situation, frozen, as illustrated, would revert back to those 7 claims and the US and Russian position to assert their own. Of course, no other state party to the treaty, despite building stations or investing in icebreakers over the past 60 years, can use any of this work or footprint as precedent for the basis of staking a claim. All right, in 1948, the US formally moved from an approach of pushing the World Park or a UN trusteeship idea for Antarctica. It moved to seek a condominium agreement with claimant states. Here, Washington saw the merge and management of claims. Primarily, the US was pushing to merge claims with Australia. Then the Chilean government proposed a treaty arrangement which neither rejected or accepted the 7 claims but facilitated global collaboration on the continent. The idea was to push the issue of sovereignty off the agenda for the foreseeable future. My archival research has indicated the majority of Antarctic documents fell under the top secret classification, illustrating an early Australian insecurity pre-1950s and in the early 50s era. Defence and intelligence records of the time indicate this was driven by fears of communist creep and the potential for submarine bases to be erected within striking distance of Melbourne and Sydney. But another element of our insecurity in the archives I found was immense distrust for Washington over Antarctic affairs. The archives indicate we were part of something called the Polar Committee, which was stood up by Britain and Australia in the late 40s to discuss and plot the US footprint and designs on Antarctica. So debate went around in circles for a decade or so when it came to how to solve our Antarctic problem. That was until the International Geophysical Year of 1957, the year George Brandis was born, in which global missions converged on the South Pole. They were focused on human endeavour and science, but it became apparent towards the end of the IGY year that the Soviets had little intent to pack up their camps or dismantle established stations. Archives show that cables back and forth between Australian security agencies and the Department of Defence noted they had no ability to evict the Soviets by force in any case. But at the same time, agencies flagged they had little problem in sharing the problem set with Washington. That was until Washington realised the sheer footprint of Soviet bases on the Antarctic continent. And the map there illustrates the basing situation in 1957. So red is USSR, not just one or two. Negotiations began in 1958 as to an Antarctic solution, which essentially sought to have the two blocs agree to disagree on sovereignty and work together anyway. This was considered utterly unattainable until it was possible. And this was no small feat because of Menzies' artful navigation of the competing interests. On the screen are excerpts from the Department of External Affairs cables between Menzies and his point man Casey, establishing the parameters of Australia's negotiation position. So for Menzies, there were four key points to the position. First, non-militarisation of the continent. Second, the freezing of status quo of claims. Third, the rejection of an international authority to govern. And interestingly, fourth, the avoidance of any restrictions on exploiting resources. So we can already see there are tensions for Australia. Menzies was seeking to protect a claim to 42% of the continent, but he was asking all parties to set aside the question of sovereignty. Yet again, at the same time, he wanted to protect the ability to execute on vast extraction rights. This is a tension that remains today. So 1959, in Washington, there are 12 original signatories. They are the 12 parties who were active in Antarctica during that IGY 1957 year. Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the UK, US, and USSR. The three components of the treaty that did align with Australian interests, as articulated by Menzies himself, include non-militarisation. The region is not to be regarded as a region in which preparations for war or conflict can be engaged. Cooperation. We're going to have more and more as a result of this association between us in cooperation for scientific research for the benefit of mankind. And on sovereign claims, it was agreed not to abandon claims, but to put aside the argument about them. Of interest in the archives I found is that during treaty negotiations, there were signals that Soviet behaviour was quote unquote unusually pleasant. It was aligned from the start with the Australian position. Most issues arose with Washington. Evidently, these issues continue today. There is zero discussion of Antarctica in any OSMIN forum since it was established in 1985. Sorry? This stamp here? Yes, I'll get into that, ask that in question time. But it's interesting to see, it's a form of, I guess, establishing your strategic interest, future claim to sovereignty, because you've made post stamps. You can now vote from Antarctica, which has upset most of our treaty partners. Australians can vote from stations, which is not in line with the treaty. 1961 meeting. Okay. This is an image of Menzies opening the first ever Antarctic Treaty consultative meeting. It's hosted in Canberra. Today, there are 29 consultative parties. This is inclusive of the original 12 signatories. These 29 parties can vote on the management of the continent, but it's all consensus-based. Overall, there are 56 parties to the treaty today, inclusive of those 29 with voting rights. And back to the image, the archives at the time and newspaper coverage is super interesting, but it speaks of this period as a mini UN for Canberra. UN translators from New York were flown over, specific translation sound booths were erected in Parliament to facilitate the event, which is still there today. It was a proud moment of global leadership for Menzies. The promise of science as a global language for Menzies was immense. So here on the slide, the top left, we have a Soviet station pictured in 1965, and then next to it to the right and below is the current development of a Russian station called Vostok. Compare the size, the materials, the footprint, the security measures, all in the name of science. But science in the 2020s is not that of the 50s. While it has always had dual-use capabilities, the advent of technology and advances in this space have even more critically blurred the military-civilian lines. Today, science is not the basis for cooperation, it is the basis for coercive and conflictual activities in Antarctica. While science is the currency of Antarctica, to a point all states are interested in it, and it does remain a point of commonality and shared passion. Indeed, since the treaty has remained in place for 60 years, is that not a mark of success? In summary for my paper, Menzies ushered in a global peace treaty at the heights of the Cold War. So why is Menzies and the Antarctic Treaty an issue of so little coverage? Why did Menzies and his team celebrate the treaty so swiftly in 1961? Why did Menzies' legacy in the battle for Antarctica fade into history? I think the Menzies Red Scare, his battle against communism and Soviet agents in Canberra, occurring at the same time the treaty negotiations were undertaken, has quite a bit to do with our absent understanding of Menzies and Antarctica. Consider, the Soviets turned up to negotiations in 1957 with essentially the same playbook that had been written by the Department of External Affairs, previously headed by Evatt. Consider, negotiations were occurring on the heels of the Petrov affair over Antarctica. Yet over Antarctica, the Menzies government found an ally in negotiations with the Soviet Union when it came to dealing with Washington. Finally, consider that diplomatic ties with Moscow were only re-established in 1959, 2 months before the signing of the Antarctic Treaty and during the heights of final negotiations. So overall, Menzies heralded science in Antarctica as a means to adequately starve off geopolitical and geostrategic competition on our back doorstep. While today science is used to legitimise enhanced non-Western footprints on the continent, it has become an unwitting Trojan horse of sorts. I leave you with this image of current contemporary Chinese research stations in Antarctica, and as you'll see, the majority fall in the Australian Antarctic Territory. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.